Tom, what do you think the public perception of Tom Praviti is?
Well, I know for a fact that I am in multiple people's phone as biochar Tom. So I think people have a relatively strong association with me and biochar. What they think of that, I don't actually know. What do you think people think of you, Emily?
Well, my name itself is quite a funny one because Emily is a very common name, but Swaddle is quite an unusual last name. And if you actually Google me, some of it is like Emily does the carbon removal show, and then you get a lot of pictures of like babies called Emily who've been swaddled.
Well, I've asked ChatGPT what the public or what the world thinks of Emily Swaddle.
Oh gosh.
And the first sentence is actually relatively positive, Emily. According to ChatGPT, Emily Swaddle is widely respected for empathetic and impactful communication on climate issues. In short, Emily Swaddle is admired not just for what she says, but for how she says it, with care, courage, and a deep sense of humanity.
Oh my gosh.
Do you want to know something really sad?
Oh gosh.
What?
I asked the same question about me, and the first sentence it says is, I couldn't find any evidence that Ben Weaver Hinks is a major public figure.
Welcome.
Welcome back to the Carbon Removal Show, Tom Praviti.
Good to have you with me here, Emily Swaddle.
We are back with another bunch of episodes for your ear holes.
Yes, prepare those ear holes of yours for another 3 episodes of carbon removal infotainment.
We're really leaning into the 3-episode chunklets this year. And why not? I like it. I'm here for it.
Yeah, well, this basket or chunklet of episodes is going to focus on public perceptions of CDR, the myths and misconceptions. How do we have the best conversations about CDR and why it's important?
Our favourite topic, Tom. We do a lot of communicating about CDR.
We do. Maybe too much. Who knows? But I think it's safe to say we have got a vested interest in this one. More so than others.
Some of you may remember we did a public perceptions episode way back in season 1.
Indeed we did.
And we loved it, speaking for the team.
It was my personal favourite of the season. And we're going to be doing more this time. We've grown, the industry has grown, public understanding has grown.
Or has it?
Yes, well, that's what we're going to find out, I guess. That is the question. These episodes are going to be a real treat. Anyone who skipped season 1, episode 8, fear not, because this, if I may say, is going to be even better.
Big words, TP. Big promises to our listeners. But I back us. Let's do this. So let's start with why this feels important to us. Just you and me here, Tom. Tell me what made you want to make this 3-parter on public perceptions.
I would say that I've consistently seen people, both in the carbon removal space and outside of it, misinterpret CDR. And I've seen this happen consistently in various different forms over the past 5 years. And I was exactly that back in 2021. And I just want to make sure that others don't make the same mistakes that we did.
Yeah, I think that's great. Excellent reasons, Tom.
And you?
Well, I guess there's a couple of things. There's a lot that the CDR industry needs in order to grow. We've talked about it at length, about many of these things that it needs. Last season, season 3, was all about scaling up. Then it felt like the missing piece that kind of linked all these questions of regulations, finances, MRV, etc. The missing link was policy. So earlier this year, we talked about policy. We did a 3-parter on that.
Check it out if you haven't listened. It's a great starter pack for CDR policy.
So to grow, we need things in place. To get them in place, maybe we need policy. And to get policy moving, I think we need the people. You know, they do say that in a democracy, policies follow the will of the people. We can debate the truth of that and whether or not democracies are alive and well. But undoubtedly, on some level, policies are swayed by public trends. So in that case, how publics perceive and interact with CDR feels very important.
It's a good point. Very true.
But even before all that, we all know that this industry needs to become huge. Like properly huge. So we need more people involved, very many more people involved, and it's going to touch so many lives. So people need to be informed. And, it's exciting. It's like a huge undertaking to inform in a way that is as transparent as can be, as accessible as possible, and also not unnecessarily overwhelming. But it's definitely exciting.
In this three-parter, we are going to be talking to researchers looking at CDR public perceptions, understanding and misconceptions.
We'll be speaking with industry insiders who work every day with publics around the world, more and more of whom are becoming key players and stakeholders in CDR.
And we'll be chatting with other CDR communicators to understand their journeys, the barriers they've faced, and some of the reactions to their work.
The thing is, no matter what your role may be within carbon removal, there's always a level of communication involved. If it's within the CDR bubble, talking to stakeholders, partners, colleagues, it may not feel like public perceptions are much of a concern to you. But we all step out of the CDR world every once in a while. If you're explaining your job to a friend or family member, if you're talking about what's important to you with those around you, then you're communicating about CDR to members of the public. And that's important. We're all kind of reps for CDR in that sense, I think.
And even if everyone that you know is already on the CDR train, congratulations on your choice of friends.
I think you could probably diversify a little. Spread your wings, might be good for you.
Possibly. Yeah, possibly. But even if you don't feel you're a communicator, stories, how we tell them and how they're received is a huge part of how this industry is going to grow.
Exactly.
So, what do people really understand about carbon removal, and why is it so hard to communicate clearly? I have some very fun facts for you, Amelia.
Very fun. I'll be the judge of that. Hit me with them.
So, the Brilliant State of CDR Report 2025 has done an analysis of the academic literature on this, and a few things are clear.
We love the State of CDR Report on this podcast. One of our faves, a recurring appearance. It is worth noting that this tends to look at UK data, so I imagine that that's what we're dealing with here.
Correct. It's UK focused, and it actually breaks down the research on this by region for anyone who's interested. But I'll give you some headlines. Firstly, we don't know a huge deal about public perceptions of CDR. The authors identified 17 empirical UK studies on public perceptions of this space up till May 2023. And it's clear that while there are some fantastic researchers doing this work, it's still a niche within a niche within a niche.
Like a babushka doll. In my opinion, it's a very important niche, But still, 17 studies isn't to be sniffed at. So what do they tell us?
No surprises here, but awareness of CDR seems to be low. Those who describe their knowledge of CDR in general as a great deal or a fair amount stands at just 5.7%, while 18 to 19% report knowledge of CDR as part of approaches to climate engineering.
It is low, but I've got to say, 5.7% is kind of more than I was anticipating. But yeah, you're right, it's not super high, and those low numbers won't come as any surprise to anyone who's, sat around a dinner party and tried to spark up a conversation about enhanced rock weathering.
Well, my dinner parties are full of CDR boffs, so don't know about you, Emily.
You need to get some friends outside the space, Tom.
Yes, I need to diversify. But, Emily, the good news, however, is that support for CDR, once people find out about it, seems to be faring much better. A national survey identified a plurality of participants supporting CDR in general.
Great. So far, so good.
But where it gets really interesting and fun is the different levels of support that different CDR methods seem to be receiving. Based on the information that we have, support for afforestation and habitat restoration are amongst the highest, while there's lower support for BECS and really the lowest for DACs of methods surveyed.
Yeah, also not a huge surprise here, I'd say. Okay, well, yeah, I would agree. These are fun facts in my definition of the term. And I'm not going to say too much about them now, because it's nice to just have these facts and kind of hold them in mind as we venture forwards on our public perceptions journey.
Yeah, agreed. This really is a case of the data reflecting the experiences that we've had in informal conversations. And in a way, it's kind of reassuring. I think we all have a sense of these things, that awareness of CDR is low, that people are often quite supportive of it when they do learn about it, and that methods that we might think of as nature-based are the ones that people find the most palatable when they first learn about the options available.
Yeah, great to know that sort of recent research. But I think we now need to do what we do best on the Carbon Removal Show, and that is give ourselves and our lovely listeners a little history lesson. Come with me, Tom, to the past.
Yes, let's rewind the tape. Let's roll the tape. Anyway. Okay.
As we've mentioned on the pod before, the scientific consensus that we need CDR has been developing for decades.
We spoke with Dave Addison, who's been working in CDR for about 15 years.
I didn't even know CDR has been around that long. Are you sure he doesn't mean like 15 months?
I'm pretty confident it's 15 years.
Okay.
It's impressive, though. I don't know, maybe a record for the guests of our show?
Not sure, cannot confirm. We'll have to fact check that one.
In any case, Dave used to work with the Virgin Earth Challenge and gave us a bit of historical context for all this. Do you remember how CDR was perceived in the noughties, Emily?
No. The noughties were just a sort of pubescent blur for me. I remember nothing but dance moves, really.
Well, luckily, Dave can set the scene for us.
I'm glad he was taking note.
Virgin ran an early innovation prize in the carbon removal space called the Virgin Earth Challenge, which Richard Branson, Al Gore, and other judges launched back in 2007. It was just over 3 years in. I started working at Virgin in the spring of 2010. This was after, I think it would have been COP15 in Copenhagen. Didn't go the way that the vast majority of people at COP15 wanted it to. That was the time of the ClimateGate emails and just a bunch of friction, to put it mildly, on that international process. And I did an undergraduate degree in physical geography, a master's at Imperial in environmental technology, loved them both. And Virgin put out an advert to that master's at Imperial saying, hey, we're looking for someone to come in just for a little internship around Easter to help work on this prize that the well-known smiley bearded founder and his mate, the former US vice president, and some other awesome judges of the time, launched for ways of taking carbon back out of the air, as well as reducing emissions in the first place. But even then, it wasn't either or. It was, look, there's too much greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. How does that shake out? It has to shake out with there being less greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. A year after that, James Hansen, who was also one of the launch judges of the Earth Challenge, the famous NASA climate scientist, wrote his famous, with co-authors, 350 parts per million target CO2 paper, which I believe was a big part of the origin of the movement 350.org, led by Bill McKibben and others, for example.
Well, that sounds pretty gravy to me. You know, big names, pioneering innovation. CDR has advocates already.
Yeah, maybe in the case of these early fans, the CDR OGs, but if we zoom out a bit, I don't think everyone was so easily sold on this.
In the very early 2010s, when one was trying to talk to a lot of stakeholders about carbon removal, it felt, as far as I can tell, quite a lot like I imagine it felt trying to talk to people about the idea of flying through the air 120 years ago or something. There's the Gandhi quote that was the effect of, first they ignore you, then they ridicule you, then they, try to shut you down, then they think it was their idea or something. I think Arthur C. Clarke had one similar as well. But in the early days of aviation, it was ridiculed. I think this is right, that even, major newspapers just wouldn't even entertain the idea of talking about these crazy Wright brothers and these wild. Who would have thought you could fly through the air with something heavier than air? Despite the fact, at the same time, obviously, it had already been evolutionary proven independently through several different pathways. Flying squirrels, bats, insects, pterosaurs, RIP, and birds. Right? It was out there, and this idea of sort of not just doing less harm to Earth's carbon cycle and climate system, but even thinking about like what does it mean to actually try and actively rebalance it, however technologically or ecologically, just seem to often precipitate a similar reaction from folks. It's just like, no, you can't do that. Or like, what you mean, like trees? Like, yeah, trees are cool. Trees are awesome. There's lots of different approaches. Rock's pretty good too. You know, well, your listeners know all this, but it was very much that kind of era.
It's giving deep science fiction vibes. No one trusts the robots.
Yeah, and you know, I kind of get it. Lots of humans generally do not trust new things until they've proven their worth. It makes me think of microwaves, you know? It's like this strange box that you can plug into the wall and it warms up your food in minutes and there's not even gas involved. It's magic. Like, who trusts that? But they've been around since like the 60s or something, and plenty of people still don't trust them.
I mean, they are pretty sus. I mean, how does it work?
I don't know. Don't trust the robots.
Anyway, this bit of context from Dave helps us begin to understand early perceptions of CDR.
Yeah, it's interesting, Dave's point about how media didn't want to cover it, which again, I sort of understand. You know, I can imagine a journalist thinking, I don't trust this, so I'm not going to write about it. But I mean, you know, get someone to do the research, get your science correspondent on it, you know?
Exactly, because if the media isn't going to report on it, how are the public's going to come to know about it?
So already we're seeing this gap in understanding and interest. On one side, we have climate scientists and climate tech investors seeking the next big thing. Then there's quite a chasm before we get to like the rest of the world, obviously with some spectrum in there too.
And somewhere on that spectrum of the rest of the world, we have policymakers, decision makers, you know, those who hold the power.
Well, we are not the first to notice that this might be an issue. Ingrid Sundvor, founder of Carbon Balance Initiative, explained how she's trying to bridge that gap.
Our mission is focused on aligning the fossil and industrial sectors with the geological net zero pathway. And this specifically focuses a lot on credible target setting, so net zero target setting, long-term policy and transition planning, and also how to scale CCS and engineered CDR responsibly to reach net zero, the net in net zero, as well as reverse temperature overshoot. Our theory of change is sort of, I guess, comes from this frustration we had when we worked in Oxford with researchers, and there was so much brilliant research being done, but there was this lack of connection with decision makers and policymakers. So we set up Carbon Balance to have this 1 foot within academia and 1 foot within the policymaking world or politics.
Ingrid acknowledges that chasm that we spoke about, with the niche of academia and industry on one side and politics on the other. Embracing CDR seems to move at quite different paces across the chasm.
It's true, but Ingrid also reminded us how in relative terms this whole area has actually grown incredibly quickly.
I started studying and focusing on climate after COP in Paris. And during that time, net zero wasn't really a word, because net zero was, even though net zero was in academic papers back in sort of early 2000s or late 2000s, you don't have this sort of word net zero becoming a prevalent or salient thing before 2017, 18, 19, 20. That's when all the targets were being set. And I think the public hasn't really, that is a really fast track of net zero targets. And the net in net zero wasn't the biggest debate. It was the emission reductions that we had to focus on first after Paris, and what we should focus on first. What I had as a sort of epiphany or a journey when I was at Oxford is that they obviously do a lot of work on the net in net zero. And the thing that I thought was very fascinating was how muddled net zero had become, how it didn't mean the same for various people. It means different things to different ecosystem stakeholders, to different governments, to different companies, etc.
So, while university departments are agreeing on the need for CDR and understanding more and more of the nuance of practicing it, everyone else is still out there arguing about the word net and net zero. You kind of have to laugh.
Yeah, it's true. It's kind of a beautiful example of this huge difference that we're talking about.
I really feel for the developers. I mean, how are projects ever supposed to get public support if there's not even public understanding?
Well, here's my question. How much does every member of the public really need to know? You know, they have their lives, they're busy. We can't expect everyone to become CDR experts, can we?
It's a really interesting question. Finding that balance of what people need to know and the details of what they don't need to understand. For Dave, it's about having the option and resources to choose.
From my perspective, carbon removal doesn't necessarily have to be for everyone, but it should be for anyone, if that makes sense. You know, would unfortunately or not, depending on her perspective, my mum ends up knowing a fair bit about carbon removal because I talked to her about it. She has to put up with her son going on about it various ways. And, you know, if she listened to a Radio 4 program, other stations are available, you know, about it, I'm sure she'd actually be quite interested. Does she then personally have to go out and lobby for this particular approach or this particular target or something? Not necessarily, but if she wants to, I'd say more power to her as far as I'm concerned. And I would advocate for a similar perspective from folks that have concerns. And I think that should be applicable to anyone. But if you have a view on carbon removal, let's talk about it, however positive or negative it is. But if you're not interested, that's cool too.
So the aim isn't necessarily to have everyone understand everything, but to make it accessible for everyone to gain understanding if they so choose.
That question of accessibility, it's really important to highlight. Opening up CDR to those who aren't living, breathing, and dreaming it every day is a vital part of the CDR work. Because as CDR approaches move out of the lab or the pilot project and into the big wide world, they're going to increasingly brush up against and come into contact with all sorts of people and stakeholders.
You can't really have carbon removal without publics, right?
That's Elspeth Spence, environmental psychologist and one of the few people who've been studying perceptions of CDR for several years.
I mean, you need public support if you want to deploy carbon removal and to scale it up especially. I mean, we see so many opposition to things like fracking or other things as well. And you end up with moratoriums when the public are like, you know, I'm not supportive of this. I don't want it to go ahead. And ultimately, these industries get damaged by this and they can't do it. And we've seen it for our marine carbon dioxide removal in Cornwall as well, for example, that if an industry is not open and includes the public from the start, then there's not that support there. And it can potentially be quite damaging for the industry. If this is to go forward and get scaled up, which ultimately it looks like, you know, like carbon removal is going to be quite important.
I think Elspeth highlights here that it's not just a case of getting public support for CDR. I mean, that's one thing, and ideally we'd have really engaged citizens who wanted CDR to happen and to happen well. But publics are an inevitable element of any large-scale project, and if they don't like what you're doing, that's going to be a problem.
And as she alludes to, there have been examples of CDR projects where the public engagement didn't go according to plan. Public perceptions aren't just some wishy-washy nice to have. Get it right, get it wrong, it has concrete impacts.
Yeah, of course, totally agreed. After all, who is Beyoncé without her beehive?
Or Bieber without his believers.
Who, Tom? Who are they?
Well, luckily, people are doing the research, so we're all more prepared when we have these conversations. Elspeth shared her experience of speaking to publics about CDR across different geographies.
Generally, when we engage with people, you know, there's always low awareness around whatever it is you're talking about. People don't know until they come into that room. We don't sort of invite people saying, we're going to talk about this topic. We'll call it something vague, like environmental challenges, for example. So you're not kind of trying to alienate people or get people who might not come in. If you advertise a topic, they're like, well, I've never heard of that. So, I mean, generally people are quite open to engaging and talking about something they've not heard about. We try and start by talking to people about other things that are more relevant. So within our workshops, we might ask them to think about their local environment. So in Malaysia, for example, we talked about, tell us about how land use change has changed over your lifetime, for example, and draw a picture so you can talk through pictures. And it's also good for breaking the ice as well. getting people comfortable before starting to talk about topics they might not be familiar with. It's usually you kind of build them up to talking about these unfamiliar topics. So we then transition into talking about climate change to see where do people sit on climate change, or are they concerned about it? And then talking about particular strategies. And then you might introduce them to, okay, there's this thing called carbon dioxide removal, before starting to talk to them about specific strategies. But we'll tend to just give them a very broad overview and then give them posters, for example, to go and look at describing different strategies. And then they stick post-its on them, for example, so they can sort of write down any concerns they have, any concerns about particular risks they might think about. So, for example, the oceans, if that's a concern, or land. Or if they see potential benefits, for example. So if it's using a renewable source, maybe that's really great, particularly if energy source is an issue, like it is in parts of Malaysia. And also questions as well that they might have that they're not sure about. So it's kind of a way to start getting them to think about it and feel free to sort of write their thoughts down without sort of asking them in that open room where it can sometimes be a bit intimidating, especially if you've got an expert present, for example. So we kind of very gradually take people on that journey rather than jumping straight in, just to try and get people comfortable and more open to talking about it.
As we know, we are often starting from very low understanding of this topic. It's a standing start and really an ease into it.
As it has to be, I guess. The stats bear that out, and so do our own experiences of having these conversations. But interestingly, Elspeth mentioned that just because understanding is low, that doesn't mean that people will struggle to connect with the potential value and the potential risks of CDR.
Because people think, okay, people don't know anything about this, so they're automatically maybe going to be like, I'm not interested in this, for example. But with our smallholders in Malaysia, for example, I mean, Emily and I, Emily Cox, sat through 2 of the workshops there, and they were run completely in Malay. Neither of us spoke any of the language, but sort of hearing the feedback from the participants in the smallholders group. So these are people who have small holdings. They're growing oil palm, they're growing, was it pineapple? I think one of them was growing. And they have various crops, and they're subsistence farmers. And they really sort of think, oh, okay, this could potentially be beneficial. So for some countries, they really see the value in some of the strategies that are talked about because it could be beneficial for them, particularly economically. For example, if they want to increase crop yields. So within Malaysia, for example, for fertilizers, some of these farmers are subsidized by the government in order to afford that. So there's a potential that if enhanced weathering, for example, was successful, that this could be used instead. So they may perhaps wouldn't have to rely as much on the government for that subsidy. So I think it's quite interesting that some of these smallholders are like, oh, I'd kind of like to know if I could try this myself. Where can I get this material, for example? So there's that openness to trying it themselves. I think it's just, is there something in place to enable them to do that?
Understanding starts low, but openness is high, at least in the case that Elspeth shared. I wonder, Tom, do you resonate with any of this? I mean, you're having these conversations in Cornwall for Restored, albeit with a slightly less data-driven approach.
We're very data-driven, Emily. Got all the data.
I don't doubt it.
I think, yeah, anecdotally, conversations that we have with these various stakeholders, whether it be a farmer that might be interested in using biochar on his or her land, I think there's initial, skepticism when you first mention something like biochar. But if you get into the details and talk about the potential benefits, you start to really see ideas sort of turn in their head. And a lot of those people that we speak to sort of go off on their own tangents in a way. They sort of come up with their own thoughts and ideas and interests on how they could potentially use this or integrate biochar and or pyrolysis within their own system. So I think it's definitely resonates with me.
One of my favourite things about our recent policy series, shout out, was where we landed at the end of it all, which was basically a rallying cry to get everyone to push the needle on CDR policy in whatever context and with whatever levers that make sense for them. And I feel like we're already seeing strains of something similar here. I'm not trying to draw us to a conclusion already. Still got 2.5 episodes to go. But what you and Elspeth both shared just really underlines for me that it's about thousands of little conversations happening in every corner of the world. Because the hopes and fears of a smallholder in Malaysia are going to have similarities and differences to those of a farmer in Cornwall, obviously. And so that means that these conversations, these all-important conversations, they're also going to share similarities and also have differences.
Because how we conceive of CDR, just like how we've encountered any new concept or technology, is going to be personal.
Mm-hmm.
It's going to depend on our context and the knowledge and experiences that we bring to the table. Interestingly, Elspeth started her career looking at perceptions of ocean acidification. And there are themes there that I think are worth thinking about.
I mean, it wasn't something I'd heard about before I started to look at it. And I think hearing the kinds of concerns people had, and the way that I looked at it was to think about how people conceptualize a particular risk they're not familiar with. So people use lots of risk associations. So, for example, the term itself, ocean acidification, people were coming up with concerns about acid rain, and maybe the ocean will burn my hand if I put in it, or it will damage the fish that are swimming around. So people have really interesting insights as to what they think a particular risk issue is based on that term. So they're using knowledge that's already available for them to try and work out, okay, what might this particular issue be about and how might it affect me? So it's a very kind of open way to start exploring how people think about issues without sort of leading them in a direction.
That is so fascinating. This idea that the words we use have such an impact on the perceptions and the kind of risk perception. I can see why ocean acidification conjures images of like hands dissolving when you put them in the water and that kind of thing. I wonder, just in terms of some of the broad language we use around carbon removal, like, are there any analogues to that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think there have probably been quite a few depending on what particular carbon removal that you're talking about. So this idea that you might perhaps talk about natural solutions or nature-based solutions, and you see people use that terminology quite a lot, and that's not just amongst certain companies or certain individuals, but also different governments as well, because that's the way that they've conceptualized it. They're like, okay, we're planting trees, that's nature-based, for example. Or perhaps if you're thinking about direct air capture, you're talking about big fans capturing things. But it kind of makes things look a bit muddled, I think, because you're using ideas or analogies that aren't really quite what you're describing, because it gives people a picture of what you're talking about, but it's not really accurate, I guess. You kind of need to go into it a little bit more. It can be problematic, I think, to stick with analogies. So it's something to be careful with, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess the flip side of that is like finding that balance between language that is going to be widely comprehensible and people will connect with versus not misleading.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because I think it's some things, it can be useful as a starting point, but it's about sort of making sure you're being clear that there are other components attached to that. So if you talk about engineered solutions, you're automatically giving people this idea it's a really industrial process, for example. So it's being really balanced, I think, about it, as you said.
That was producer Ben speaking with Elspeth, in case you didn't recognise him. Let's start a campaign to get Ben on the pod more. Anyway, this is so interesting. And Tom, I think it's time. I think you know what it's time for.
Oh no, yeah, I think I know. It's that time, isn't it? Right, go on then. Chat language to me. Hit me.
Well, okay. Seeing as you've given me your permission, your consent.
Begrudgingly.
I really want to zoom in on something that Elspeth raised here. Analogies. Now, we are no stranger to analogies on this podcast. We've talked about them in the past when we were looking at scaling CDR, but that was more about getting the industry to rally behind a vision. But what Elspeth helped remind me is that we're already using analogies all the time when we're building our understanding of something new. And because everyone's using the info that they already have, these analogies are often the wrong ones, or at least not the best ones, you know?
Like with ocean acidification.
Yeah. I mean, not to get super technical about it, but you can see the problem with that one. Since pre-industrial times, oceans have dropped about 0.1 pH units, which is a lot for an ocean ecosystem and is a serious problem. But it's on a very different scale to anything that's going to like burn you if you touch it. We're not talking that level of acidity.
Yeah. It's funny because when you say ocean acidification or acid rain, I instantly think of being burnt alive if I touch it.
Yeah, and it's like green and bubbly, and it's got like a label next to it that says toxic.
Like in chemistry class.
Yeah. But I think in this case, because the scientific scale of change is microscopic compared with the everyday sensory one that people imagine, the scientific meaning of acidification kind of like drifts away from the popular one. It's like we're getting two different words almost. You know, we have the right word, acidification is correct, but it somehow gives the wrong impression because of the analogies that people are using to understand it.
Right word, wrong impression.
Mm-hmm.
This is a pickle.
Slimy, acidic pickle.
Yeah, this is a acidic pickle. It sort of raises the question, I mean, how directly can we translate scientific knowledge to popular knowledge?
Yeah. I don't know. You know, answering that is way above my pay grade and qualifications. But it gets all the more complex when we're maybe using wrong words entirely, you know? Even when you're using the right words, people can get the wrong impression. So when we start using the wrong words, oi.
Things turn sour.
Yeah.
Elspeth highlights how metaphors like nature-based or engineered can unintentionally mislead. Well, this nature question, it comes up a lot. Here's Rob Bellamy, senior lecturer in climate and society at the University of Manchester. If he sounds familiar, you might have heard him way back in Season 2, Episode 3. Also, he's one of the authors of the State of CDR 2025 report, which we mentioned a little earlier.
This isn't just about carbon removal, this is about anything that's referred to as natural or otherwise. The idea of nature suggests that there is something external, pristine, and separate from humans. And the thing is, when you label certain approaches as being natural or nature-based and other ones as not, then you're kind of, first of all, implying that the other things that are not included in this category are unnatural. But here's the problem. The problem is that we know, and this is probably the most robust finding across all social science research in carbon removal, certainly what we found when we were doing the State of CDR report and reviewing what kind of affects how people perceive things. The problem with this is that we know what's framed as being natural is perceived as being better. People like it more. But of course, the reality is what's natural and what isn't natural is socially constructed. I mean, there's been loads of attempts to try and categorize CDR along these two lines. And you can find also numerous examples of where people have kind of got examples that don't quite neatly fit into the categories or could very easily fit into any of the other categories. So, for example, one of my favorite examples is biochar and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, for example. So both of them involve what you might call technology. So they involve pyrolysis plants or bioenergy plants. They both also involve what you might call natural materials, so biomass. But frequently, biochar has been framed as being natural, whereas BECCS has been framed as being unnatural or technological. So it's kind of, you get this false binary, basically. It's just an unhelpful category that privileges certain approaches over others for no reason at all, really, other than the fact that people like natural stuff, right? And you see this stuff all the time in marketing on TV and, wherever. You hear people kind of companies invoking natural products, natural tea or natural toothpaste or whatever it is. People prefer those things. And the marketers, they use that because they know it works. But what this does is it kind of, well, first of all, it kind of harms approaches that are not seen as natural or framed as not being natural. And it gives a boost to those that are framed that way for no good reason. And then it also deflects attention from the actual qualities of the carbon removal approaches that we're talking about. So rather than kind of evaluating them on important metrics like, well, how much carbon is it removing? How much does it cost? What are the impacts? All of these different things are the things that we should be evaluating things on, rather than this kind of mystical notion as to whether something is natural or not. But there's also this kind of wider romanticist kind of view in society that kind of exists around this kind of separation between humans and nature, which we're kind of trying to work against, I suppose, so that we can evaluate things properly. So it's an uphill struggle trying to get people to kind of think about these things in this way. But I think this is, for me, this has been the most interesting and the most difficult part of working on perceptions of carbon removal.
This is a bit of a tricky one. The whole nature-based versus engineered thing to me just seems unhelpful. Although that's not true, because I can understand that there is a need for people who don't understand all that much about these technologies to recognize that some of them kind of feel a bit more natural and some of them kind of feel a little bit more engineered. But the reality is that everything about CDR is both natural and engineered. Like all CDR techniques are essentially trying to like amplify or support natural systems that are already in place. The carbon cycles are natural systems. They're all part of that in a nature way, right? And also, they're all engineered by humans, because if you don't engineer removing the carbon from the atmosphere, you can't even class it as CDR. That's just like the natural carbon cycle doing its thing. So it's a false dichotomy, and it can be really frustrating. And I do totally also see Rob's point about this like separation we have from nature, that it's like special and clean and we're not part of it. And that disconnect between us and nature, quote unquote, also makes me ask, what does it mean to be engineered? Is all human activity not innately natural because we are, in fact, natural to this planet? And the crises that we see around us right now, it's my belief that we wouldn't be in them, or at very least we wouldn't be so deep in them, if we didn't have this disconnection in the first place. Holding humanity as separate from the natural world has not only given us a superiority complex, but has led to essentially eco-colonialism, and that is what has got us in this problem to begin with.
There's a public speaker in you, Emily.
Thank you so much.
Really, you should run. You should run for something. What we do know is that there is, as you've been alluding to, loads of baggage attached to those natural or engineered labels. And this is actually taken advantage of in marketing a lot. Think of food, 100% natural ingredients. You see that and you instantly sort of have this perception that it's going to be good for you.
Yeah.
But it's kind of meaningless because, a lot of things are natural. Poisons are natural.
It's true. And then the other end on the food spectrum is what they are calling ultra-processed foods. But there is actually no definition of that right now. But I didn't know you knew so much about natural poisons, Tom, and it does make me a little bit suspicious of the next time I'm down in Cornwall around your dinner table. You
mean the dinner where we'll be talking about ERW all the time?
We usually talk about biochar, so it'd be a nice change to talk about ERW, to be fair. But you're right, Tom, about the marketing thing. And I think we've seen this a lot in terms of how so-called nature-based solutions are often advertised, leaning in heavily to the eco words and the pictures of leaves and nice, pretty green things and maybe a little bit of yellow, but not too much yellow because it's not dead green things, all that jazz.
Yeah, I mean, fair play to them. It obviously works, as the data tells us. Going back to those stats that we opened with, those fun facts, these solutions do have the widest public support.
But when we're thinking a bit broader about framing the CDR message in a way that gets people engaged in the real world challenges and opportunities, maybe we have a responsibility to find language that starts from a slightly more neutral base.
Yeah, and this responsibility is something I really picked up on when speaking with Rob. He explained how, with new technologies, the scope for shaping meaning is particularly high.
With carbon removal and many other technologies as well, like hydrogen, other things like that, we'd call them upstream technologies. So they're kind of quite early stage, well in advance of significant research and development. I know obviously in carbon removal over the last few years, we've seen a bit of an explosion of work in this area, but in the great scheme of things, it's still very, very small. There's a lot more to be done. So I think it's fair to say, we're still very much at an upstream phase. And when you're in this kind of early stage, we don't really know exactly what the end result's going to be, what the technologies are going to look like when they're deployed, when they're being used. So this provides a huge amount of scope for envisaging them in different ways, or framing them in different ways. And that can have very different impacts on the way people assess them, on the way people perceive them. So we need to be reflexive. This means kind of, thinking about how different framings can affect the way people assess and perceive them.
It feels then to me as though that's an opportunity because we can help write the narrative. But at the same time, that's a big responsibility and potentially a big challenge because it could then go in any direction. People can interpret it in any which way they choose to. How do you guys in the academic world sort of think about that?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, yeah, we have to be really careful about it because, certain framings will produce effects that are kind of undesirable, will create undesirable effects. But the other thing, and this is the way I prefer to see it, where I'd like to place the emphasis really, is seeing it as an opportunity. Because it's such early stage, it means that carbon removal doesn't have to look like what you think it will look like. It can look completely different. So we're at a kind of unique stage in the kind of technology development process where we can kind of, intervene, try and shape what this future technology looks like. It could be done in all sorts of different ways. A really colourful example of carbon removal being done in a different way would be communist carbon removal. I'm not advocating for that necessarily, but I'm just kind of giving it as a, really kind of colourful example of how it could be done differently.
I think we are getting to the nub of why public perceptions of CDR are actually so important. It's much more than a question of whether people support CDR in broad terms, or even if they support particular CDR methods or projects that might take shape within their communities.
Agreed. It's about how CDR might happen. Who's paying for it, how is it being managed, who's responsible for its successes and its failures. And as Rob said, we're so early in the CDR story still that all of this is still up for grabs. CDR isn't just hardware.
It could be done differently with different technologies as well. And this is something that we in CORE were looking at in a recent piece of research, actually, where we did a survey. In particular, we were looking at direct air capture and ocean alkalinity enhancement. And we were interested in seeing if changing the kind of governance arrangements around these two technologies might change the way people perceive them. Yeah, so our starting point with this is kind of recognizing that carbon removal technologies are not just bits of kit, they're not just physical objects, they're what we call socio-technical systems. So they're a combination, a very tightly interwoven combination of physical objects and social arrangements. So, you kind of, your DAX plants or your kind of bioenergy facilities, they're not going to work without people, without procedures, without policies. And, and perceptions research in the past has very much focused on looking at the technologies. What do people think about the physical artifacts? Or what do people think about the social responses to those physical artifacts? But very few people have been looking at what kind of effects different social arrangements might have on the way people perceive them. And in this particular study, we were looking at kind of different ways of governing DAX and ocean alkalinity enhancement. And we found, in the case of ocean alkalinity enhancement, quite a clear preference for a more kind of bottom-up, decentralized approach to conduct, whereas DAX was interestingly a bit more kind of, there weren't any kind of clear preferences there. So we've suggested that it might be more socially flexible in the sense that it could be, more readily deployed across different implementation contexts.
In so many ways, this conversation is bringing us back to well-trodden themes. Trust, governance, all those important things. But thinking about them through the lens of public perception is something we haven't spent much time on, and I think it's worth doing. Because as Rob indicates, when publics react to CDR, they're also reacting to who they think is in charge and whose values it reflects.
And what really struck me about Rob's examples there is that publics are clearly prepared for more sophisticated conversations about CDR than perhaps we give them credit for. Just because they don't already understand the tech or the science, it doesn't mean that they can't talk about the ethics and the governance questions when they're given a little bit more information.
Totally. I actually think this is an important exercise in humility. We didn't know very much at all about CDR 5 years ago, and now we kind of do little else but talk about it. I think we need to recognise that just because people are a few steps further behind us on the CDR knowledge ladder, it doesn't mean they won't have really valuable insights once we give them a hand up to the next rung. And also, we have met so many people in CDR over the past 5 years. We have built personal relationships which allow us to trust what's going on, trust what these people are doing, these people we know. And that makes it easier for us to just sort of poo-poo concerns about if this is the right thing to be doing. Not only do we have more knowledge about it, but we also have more experience of the people who are doing it, you know?
No, well, we shouldn't be poo-pooing people's opinions. We want to bring more people to the table. So yeah, some good metaphors, Emily. Interesting use of language, as always.
Thanks, Tom. Actually, the Carbon Balance Initiative has recently done some fascinating research into who publics think should pay for CDR. So this isn't just research on like, what is CDR? Do you know what it is? Do you know what that means? Do you know how it's done? This is like, okay, who's going to pay for this? People have opinions. People can contribute to this, as demonstrated through this research.
So this is a recent evidence briefing that we published in August, and it came about we have some great colleagues at CORE, specifically working at both Oxford and Imperial College, who was seeking to do this big public attitudes towards CDR survey in the UK. And they asked us to contribute to that study, specifically on a section on sort of public attitudes towards who should pay and which policy mechanisms the public prefers. And there's other papers out there that uses the same data set. But we decided to really focus on those angles of policy and economics, if you want, but more the ethics almost of who should pay or the preferences of who should pay.
So can you talk us through the sort of key findings, what came out of the study, and if there was anything in particular for you that stood out as relevant or surprising or particularly interesting?
One of the insights was that there is a strong support across the participants and then the UK public to go for compliance-based policy over voluntary measures. So this is measures like direct regulation on companies that emit or on fossil fuel companies and get them to pay for CDR. So that was a very clear indication that we need to go in that direction. The other thing that we found connected to this was that we found that nearly half of the UK public supported that fossil fuel producers should pay for CDR, which for us indicates that there is a potential viability of support for a producer responsibility framework. The third, which was actually maybe the surprising bit for me, was that pass-on cost. So the fact that you would regulate the companies to do something, they often then pass on the cost because that it might be a tax and they put it on the product and you ultimately buy the product. But this didn't seem to, in our results, to be a deal breaker for the UK public. It has some impact, and it particularly will have some impacts if some people have higher concerns over their own financial security or financial ability to contribute. But it wasn't a deal breaker, and most people knew that this would happen, and many of those who knew did not change their position, that they would still support a regulation on fossil fuel companies or on emitters.
Whew, okay. Where does that leave us, Tom, at the end of this episode?
Well, there's a few things, I think, just to touch on here. Firstly, we've had that reminder from Rob that he sees this space currently as in an upstream phase. And that's really a chance for us to shape CDR differently, and that can help us build in the justice piece, the participation or wider participation, and critically transparency before we're locking in this industry.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a really exciting time to be looking into this space and working in this space. Secondly, I mean, the devil's in the detail, right? Language is so important. And it's something that I think we did a good job of being aware of in the first season, and it's only going to become more important.
We need to get you your own jingle.
Yeah, I need mine.
Timothy's
maybe.
language chat.
Perhaps
Tom
there's going to be
Praviti's
one of those.
language chat.
I mean, you do such a good job at them, Emily, but maybe there's
Thank you so much.
space for another language chat. But yeah, this language piece is critical. And ultimately, familiarity with this space is low amongst publics. We know that. But the public still have opinions, and valid opinions. You know, as Ingrid points out in their survey, 48% of participants want fossil fuel producers to pay for CDR, which is almost 3 times more than those selecting users to pay for it.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible, those numbers, to be honest. And I love that people are forming opinions, no matter what level of understanding they have at this point, you know? Understanding can grow, opinions can change. We just got to have the conversation. We've got to have an informed and an open conversation. But as many of us in CDR know, and kind of in very many fields, to be honest, it's one thing to educate and engage people with what CDR is, and it's a whole other thing to do that in an environment of misinformation. You can just imagine people like maybe their first interaction with CDR, their first hearing of what it is or how it's done is like sensationalized, and they go straight from like unfamiliarity with what this is to like contestation, and then there's immediate polarization here in the conversation around CDR. Unfortunately, that is happening.
So why is the CDR message often failing and contested? Well, that's on the next episode.
We'll be back next time for episode 2 of our Public Perceptions Deep Dive. See you then. Goodbye.
See you later. Thank you for listening to the Carbon Removal Show.
Please subscribe if you haven't already and follow us. We're on LinkedIn, Instagram, Threads. It helps so much.
And if you could do me this one favour, share this podcast with a friend or a colleague who might resonate with this episode.
A huge thank you to all our coalition members, without whom the Carbon Removal Show would not be possible.
B0, Carbon Engineering, Carbon Gap, Carbon Future,
ClimeFi, Ivatama, Klarna, Matchmakes,
Milky Wire, Negative Emissions Platform, OPNA,
Patch, Pinwheel, Plan Boo, Recarber,
Sebastian Manhart, Standard Gas Technologies, Supercritical, and Offstream.
If you or your company are interested in joining this amazing coalition, please get in touch.
The Carbon Removal Show is hosted by me, Tom Praviti,
And me, Emily Swaddle.
And produced by me, Ben Weaver-Hinks.